Chapter 9, Part 4 of Through the Brazilian Wilderness. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Darvinia. Through the Brazilian Wilderness by Theodore Roosevelt. Chapter 9, Down an Unknown River into the Equatorial Forest. Part 4. The next day we made another long portage round some rapids, and camped at night still in the hot, wet, sunless atmosphere of the gorge. The following day, April 6th, we portaged past another set of rapids, which proved to be the last of the rapids of the chasm. For some kilometres we kept passing hills, and feared lest any moment we might again find ourselves fronting another mountain gorge, with, in such case, further days of grinding and perilous labour ahead of us, while our men were disheartened, weak, and sick. Most of them had already begun to have fever. Their condition was inevitable after over a month's uninterrupted work of the hardest kind in getting through the long series of rapids we had just passed, and a long further delay, accompanied by wearing labour, would have almost certainly meant that the weakest among our party would have begun to die. There were already two of the camaradas who were too weak to help the others, their condition being such as to cause us serious concern. However, the hills gradually sank into a level plain, and the river carried us through it at a rate that enabled us during the remainder of the day to reel off 36 kilometres, a record that for the first time held out promise. Twice tapirs swam the river while we passed, but not near my canoe. However, the previous evening Cherry had killed 2 monkeys, and Kermit 1, and we all had a few mouthfuls of fresh meat. We had already had a good soup made out of a turtle Kermit had caught. We had to portage by one short set of rapids, the unloaded canoes being brought down without difficulty. At last, at 4 in the afternoon, we came to the mouth of a big river running in from the right. We thought it was probably the Ananas, but of course could not be certain. It was less in volume than the one we had descended, but nearly as broad, its breadth at this point being 95 yards as against 120 for the larger river. There were rapids ahead, immediately after the junction, which took place in latitude 10 degrees 58 minutes south. We had come 216 kilometres all told, and were nearly north of where we had started. We camped on the point of land between the two rivers. It was extraordinary to realize that here, about the 11th degree, we were on such a big river, utterly unknown to the cartographers, and not indicated by even a hint on any map. We named this big tributary Rio Cardozo, after a gallant officer of the commission who had died of beriberi just as our expedition began. We spent a day at this spot, determining our exact position by the sun, and afterward by the stars, and sending on 2 men to explore the rapids in advance. They returned with the news that there were big cataracts in them, and that they would form an obstacle to our progress. They had also caught a huge illuroid fish, which furnished an excellent meal for everybody in camp. This evening at sunset, the view across the broad river from our camp, where the two rivers joined, was very lovely, and for the first time we had an open space in front of and above us, so that after nightfall the stars and the great waxing moon were glorious overhead, and against the rocks in midstream the broken water gleamed like tossing silver. The huge catfish which the men had caught was over 3 feet and a half long, with the usual enormous head out of all proportions to the body, and the enormous mouth out of all proportion to the head. Such fish, although their teeth are small, swallow very large prey. This one contained the nearly digested remains of a monkey. Probably the monkey had been seized while drinking from the end of a branch, and once engulfed in that yawning cavern there was no escape. We Americans were astounded at the idea of a catfish making prey of a monkey, but our Brazilian friends told us that in the lower Madeira, and the part of the Amazon near its mouth, there is a still more gigantic catfish, which in similar fashion occasionally makes prey of man. This is a grayish-white fish, over 9 feet long, with the usual disproportionately large head and gaping mouth, with a circle of small teeth; for the engulfing mouth itself is the danger, not the teeth. It is called the piraiba, pronounced in 4 syllables. While stationed at the small city of Itacoatiara on the Amazon, at the mouth of the Madeira, the doctor had seen one of these monsters which had been killed by the 2 men it had attacked. They were fishing in a canoe when it rose from the bottom, for it is a ground fish, and raising itself half out of the water lunged over the edge of the canoe at them with open mouth. They killed it with their falcons, as machetes are called in Brazil. It was taken round the city in triumph in an ox cart. The doctor saw it, and said it was 3 meters long. He said that swimmers feared it even more than the big cayman, because they could see the latter, whereas the former lay hid at the bottom of the water. Colonel Rondon said that in many villages where he had been on the lower Madeira, the people had built stockaded enclosures in the water, in which they bathed, not venturing to swim in the open water for fear of the piraiba and the big cayman. Next day, April 8th, we made 5 kilometers only, as there was a succession of rapids. We had to carry the loads past 2 of them, but ran the canoes without difficulty, for on the west side were long canals of swift water through the forest. The river had been higher, but was still very high, and the current raced round the many islands that at this point divided the channel. At 4 we made camp at the head of another stretch of rapids, over which the Canadian canoes would have danced without shipping a teaspoonful of water, but which our dugouts could only run empty. Cherry killed 3 monkeys, and Lyra caught 2 big piranhas, so that we were again all of us well provided with dinner and breakfast. When a number of men doing hard work are most of the time on half rations, they grow to take a lively interest in any reasonably full meal that does arrive. On the 10th we repeated the proceedings, a short quick run, a few 100 meters portage, occupying, however, at least a couple of hours. Again a few minutes' run, again other rapids. We again made less than 5 kilometers. In the 2 days we had been descending nearly a meter for every kilometer we made in advance, and it hardly seemed as if this state of things could last, for the aneroid showed that we were getting very low down. How I longed for a big Maine birch bark, such as that in which I once went down the Mattawamkeag at high water! It would have slipped down these rapids as a girl trips through a country dance. But our loaded dugouts would have shoved their noses under every curl. The country was lovely. The wide river, now in one channel, now in several channels, wound among hills. The shower-freshened forest glistened in the sunlight. The many kinds of beautiful palm fronds and the huge pacova leaves stamped the peculiar look of the tropics on the whole landscape. It was like passing by water through a gigantic botanical garden. In the afternoon we got an elderly toucan, a piranha, and a reasonably edible side-necked river turtle, so we had fresh meat again. We slept as usual in earshot of rapids. We had been out 6 weeks, and almost all the time we had been engaged in wearily working our own way down and past rapid after rapid. Rapids are by far the most dangerous enemies of explorers and travellers who journey along these rivers. Next day was a repetition of the same work. All the morning was spent in getting the loads to the foot of the rapids, at the head of which we were encamped, down which the canoes were run empty. Then for 30 or 40 minutes we ran down the swift twisting river, the 2 lashed canoes almost coming to grief at one spot, where a swirl of the current threw them against some trees on a small submerged island. Then we came to another set of rapids, carried the baggage down past them, and made camp long after dark in the rain. A good exercise in patience for those of us who were still suffering somewhat from fever. No one was in really buoyant health. For some weeks we had been sharing part of the contents of our boxes with the camaradas, but our food was not very satisfying to them. They needed quantity, and the mainstay of each of their meals was a mass of palmitas. But on this day they had no time to cut down palms. We finally decided to run these rapids with the empty canoes, and they came down in safety. On such a trip it is highly undesirable to take any save necessary risks, for the consequences of disaster are too serious. And yet if no risks are taken the progress is so slow that disaster comes anyhow, and it is necessary perpetually to vary the terms of the perpetual working compromise between rashness and over caution. This night we had a very good fish to eat, a big silvery fellow called a pescada, of a kind we had not caught before. One day Trigueiro failed to embark with the rest of us, and we had to camp where we were next day to find him. Easter Sunday we spent in the fashion with which we were altogether too familiar. We only ran in a clear course for 10 minutes all told, and spent 8 hours in portaging the loads past rapids down which the canoes were run. The balsa was almost swamped. This day we caught 28 big fish, mostly piranhas, and everybody had all he could eat for dinner and for breakfast the following morning. The forenoon of the following day was a repetition of this wearisome work, but late in the afternoon the river began to run in long quiet reaches. We made 15 kilometers, and for the first time in several weeks camped where we did not hear the rapids. The silence was soothing and restful. The following day, April 14th, we made a good run of some 32 kilometers. We passed a little river which entered on our left. We ran 2 or 3 light rapids, and portaged the loads by another. The river ran in long and usually tranquil stretches. In the morning, when we started, the view was lovely. There was a mist, and for a couple of miles the great river, broad and quiet, ran between the high walls of tropical forest, the tops of the giant trees showing dim through the haze. Different members of the party caught many fish, and shot a monkey, and a couple of jacarechinga birds, kin to a turkey, but the size of a fowl, so we again had a camp of plenty. The dry season was approaching, but there were still heavy drenching rains. On this day the men found some new nuts of which they liked the taste, but the nuts proved unwholesome, and half of the men were very sick and unable to work the following day. In the balsa only 2 were left fit to do anything, and Kermit plied a paddle all day long. Accordingly it was a rather sorry crew that embarked the following morning, April 15th, but it turned out a red-letter day. The day before we had come across cuttings, a year old, which were probably, but not certainly, made by pioneer rubbermen. But on this day, during which we made 25 kilometers, after running 2 hours and a half, we found on the left bank a board on a post with the initials J.A., to show the farthest up point which a rubberman had reached and claimed as his own. An hour further down we came on a newly built house in a little planted clearing, and we cheered heartily. No one was at home, but the house, of palm thatch, was clean and cool. A couple of dogs were on watch, and the belongings showed that a man, a woman, and a child lived there, and had only just left. Another hour brought us to a similar house, where dwelt an old black man, who showed the innate courtesy of the Brazilian peasant. We came on these rubbermen and their houses in about latitude 10 degrees 24 minutes. In mid-afternoon we stopped at another clean, cool, picturesque house of palm thatch. The inhabitants all fled at our approach, fearing an Indian raid, for they were absolutely unprepared to have anyone come from the unknown regions upstream. They returned, and were most hospitable and communicative, and we spent the night there. Said Antonio Correa to Kermit, "It seems like a dream to be in a house again, and hear the voices of men and women, instead of being among those mountains and rapids." The river was known to them as the Castanho, and was the main affluent, or rather the left or western branch, of the Aripuana. The Castanho is a name used by the rubber gatherers only. It is unknown to the geographers. We were, according to our informants, about 15 days' journey from the confluence of the two rivers, but there were many rubbermen along the banks, some of whom had become permanent settlers. We had come over 300 kilometers in 48 days, over absolutely unknown ground. We had seen no human being, although we had twice heard Indians. 6 weeks had been spent in steadily slogging our way down through the interminable series of rapids. It was astonishing before, when we were on a river of about the size of the upper Rhine or Elbe, to realize that no geographer had any idea of its existence. But after all, no civilized man of any grade had ever been on it. Here, however, was a river with people dwelling along the banks, some of whom had lived in the neighborhood for 8 or 10 years, and yet on no standard map was there a hint of the river's existence. We were putting on the map a river running through between 5 and 6 degrees of latitude, of between 7 and 8, if, as should properly be done, the lower Aripuana is included as part of it, of which no geographer, in any map published in Europe or the United States or Brazil, had even admitted the possibility of the existence, for the place actually occupied by it was filled on the maps by other imaginary streams, or by mountain ranges. Before we started, the Amazonas Boundary Commission had come up the lower Aripuana and then the eastern branch, or upper Aripuana, to 8 degrees 48 minutes, following the course which for a couple of decades had been followed by the rubbermen, but not going as high. An employee either of this commission or of one of the big rubbermen had been up the Castanho, which is easy of ascent in its lower course, to about the same latitude, not going nearly as high as the rubbermen had gone. This we found out while we ourselves were descending the lower Castanho. The lower main stream, and the lower portion of its main affluent, the Castanho, had been commercial highways for rubbermen and settlers for nearly 2 decades, and, as we speedily found, were as easy to traverse as the upper stream which we had just come down was difficult to traverse. But the governmental and scientific authorities, native and foreign, remained in complete ignorance, and the rubbermen themselves had not the slightest idea of the headwaters, which were in country never hitherto traversed by civilized men. Evidently the Castanho was, in length, at least substantially equal, and probably superior, to the upper Aripuana. It now seemed even more likely that the Ananas was the headwaters of the main stream than of the Cardozo. For the first time this great river, the greatest affluent of the Madeira, was to be put on the map, and the understanding of its real position and real relationship, and the clearing up of the complex problem of the sources of all these lower right-hand affluents of the Madeira, was rendered possible by the 7 weeks of hard and dangerous labour we had spent in going down an absolutely unknown river, through an absolutely unknown wilderness. At this stage of the growth of world geography, I esteemed it a great piece of good fortune to be able to take part in such a feat which represented the capping of the pyramid which during the previous 7 years had been built by the labour of the Brazilian Telegraphic Commission. We had passed the period when there was a chance of peril, of disaster, to the whole expedition. There might be risk ahead to individuals, and some difficulties and annoyances for all of us, but there was no longer the least likelihood of any disaster to the expedition as a whole. We now no longer had to face continual anxiety, the need of constant economy with food, the duty of labour with no end in sight, and bitter uncertainty as to the future. It was time to get out. The wearing work under very unhealthy conditions was beginning to tell on everyone. Half of the camaradas had been down with fever and were much weakened. Only a few of them retained their original physical and moral strength. Cherrie and Kermit had recovered, but both Kermit and Lyra still had bad sores on their legs from the bruises received in the water work. I was in worse shape. The after effects of the fever still hung on, and the leg which had been hurt while working in the rapids with the sunken canoe had taken a turn for the bad and developed an abscess. The good doctor, to whose unwearied care and kindness I owe much, had cut it open and inserted a drainage tube, an added charm being given the operation and the subsequent dressings by the enthusiasm with which the Pionche and Bohachudish took part therein. I could hardly hobble, and was pretty well laid up. But there aren't no stop conductor while a battery's charging ground. No man has any business to go on such a trip as ours unless he will refuse to jeopardize the welfare of his associates by any delay caused by a weakness or ailment of his. It is his duty to go forward, if necessary on all fours, until he drops. Fortunately, I was put to no such test. I remained in good shape until we had passed the last of the rapids of the chasms. When my serious trouble came, we had only canoe riding ahead of us. It is not ideal for a sick man to spend the hottest hours of the day stretched on the boxes in the bottom of a small open dugout, under the well-nigh intolerable heat of the torrid sun of the mid-tropics, varied by blinding, drenching downpours of rain, but I could not be sufficiently grateful for the chance. Kermit and Cherrie took care of me as if they had been trained nurses, and Colonel Rondon and Lyra were no less thoughtful. The North was calling strongly to the three men of the North. Rocky Dell Farm to Cherrie, Sagamore Hill to me, and to Kermit the call was stronger still. After nightfall we could now see the Dipper well above the horizon, upside down, with the 2 pointers pointing to a north star below the world's rim. But the Dipper, with all its stars. In our home country spring had now come, the wonderful northern spring of long glorious days, of brooding twilights, of cool delightful nights. Robin and bluebird, meadowlark and song sparrow were singing in the mornings at home. The maple buds were red. Windflowers and bloodroot were blooming, while the last patches of snow still lingered. The rapture of the hermit thrush in Vermont, the serene golden melody of the wood thrush on Long Island, would be heard before we were there to listen. Each man to his home and to his true love. Each was longing for the homely things that were so dear to him, for the home people who were dearer still, and for the one who was dearest of all. End of chapter 9.